You need more conflict in your screenplay, but you're kind of feeling tapped out, like you don't know what else to do. Or worse, what you do is just more of the same kind of conflict, and that makes your story start to feel like it's a one-trick pony. So I'm going to give you 5 tips for how to add more conflict in your story, and I'm 99.999999999% sure that you can use at least one of them. Let's jump in. We've got to start with talking about the types of conflict in a story, because if I don't, some of the tips may not make sense to you as I want them to. So we're going to backtrack just a little bit on what conflict is, why you need it, types of conflict you have at your disposal, and then we'll get to the tips. So we're going to get there, I promise. What is conflict? It's an obstacle for any character in getting what they want. A story is someone who wants something badly, they're having trouble getting it, and they get it or they don't. So your main character's going after something, but your supporting characters also have wants. Any conflict that keeps any character from getting what they want, that's conflict. Any obstacle, any issue, anything that's in the way, that's conflict. Anything. I just want to make this clear. Anything that gets in the way of any character, it's not just your main character, it's any character. And a lot of times when we think of conflict, we're just like, oh, I got to give conflict to my main character. No, you've got to give conflict to your main and supporting characters. All of them need conflict all the time. Anything that gets in the way of any character is considered conflict. You know, in stories I read from my students and clients, one of the notes I most often give is this: you need more conflict. And it's because, honestly, I understand this because we've created these characters and we love them. They're our creation. They're our babies, especially the heroes of our story. But what happens is we end up not making it hard enough for them to get what they want. I mean, you've got to punish your characters, especially your main character. Not just them, though. All the characters. You've got to make it difficult for any character pursuing anything. That includes the antagonist. That includes supporting characters. You've got to make it difficult for them. If you're too easy on any of your characters, the story starts to feel flat and predictable and leaves the audience unsatisfied. I mean, if you've ever gotten a note on your story of like, hey, it just kind of feels a little predictable, or it kind of feels like I've already seen it, it's probably because you don't have enough conflict. As an audience, we are voyeurs and a bit demented, honestly, at our core, because we like watching people suffer. And if they suffer and then still are finally able to get what they're after, okay, now as an audience, we feel satisfied. We feel like we got our money's worth. So you need to punish your main character. You need to punish your supporting characters. Give them obstacles, give them conflict. But it's not just for the audience's satisfaction that you need conflict. I mean, that's one reason, yes, but here's a big reason. If you have no conflict, your story is over. As soon as the conflict ends, it's the end. A story, remember, is about someone who wants something badly and they're having trouble getting it, the conflict, and they get it or they don't. But if there is no trouble standing in their way, if there's no trouble, they want something, well, they just go get it. They quickly get what they're after, they get their want, done, story's over. So as long as you have conflict on some level, the story continues. What this means is you must always have some type of conflict in your story. If at any point the conflict is resolved, the audience is done. So what you have to do is you've got to create overlapping elements of conflict. I start this one, I start another one. This one might get resolved, but I've got this one going on. But then there's another one that starts and another one that starts, and now these are going. This one might get resolved, this one gets resolved, this one's still going. You've got to overlap them all throughout your story. Some long-term, some short-term. Some types of conflict may only exist in one scene. There's a conflict in that scene, and then it's done. It might even be just a small moment, while there's other types of conflict that extend through the entire story or through really large sections of your story. And you get it. You're like, I got it, Jake. I know I need some conflict. That's great. So let's get into some types of conflict that you have at your disposal that you can use to make it harder on your characters. There are really 3 buckets for conflict. You've got an internal bucket, an interpersonal bucket, and an external bucket. And each of those buckets, they have subcategories or smaller buckets if you want to think about it like that. Every kind of conflict, whatever you think up, every kind of conflict can be dumped into one of those three buckets. And I'll pull them apart here in a second, but let me say here that you want to be careful about how you double dip on the buckets for types of conflict. Ideally, any scene with two or more people, you're going to have the following. You're going to have some internal conflict, you're going to have some interpersonal conflict, and you're probably going to have some external conflict. And really, if you've got two people, we're talking about at least four types of conflict in one scene. Because you've got internal conflict for character A, you've got internal conflict for character B, there's some interpersonal conflict between them, and there's some external conflict that's impacting both A and B. Now, you don't want to max out on the conflict in every scene. So I don't want to have like 4 or 5 types of conflict for two characters in every scene, because that's just exhausting for the audience. You don't want to do that. You got to give them at least a little bit of time to breathe, okay? But you should be aware of what types of conflict you have available to you so you can turn the screws when you want to turn the screws. And as soon as you add more people in the scene, you also have exponentially more options. So if I've got 2 characters in a scene, I've really got like 4, maybe 5 options. I'll get to how to do all of that. But if I've got 3 characters, now we're talking like 7 to 10 types of conflict in one scene, and it just grows from there. Now, most stories I read for my students or clients have in any given scene only 1 type of conflict, maybe 2, maybe. And that's just not enough to sustain a story, because it makes your characters feel flat. I mean, if you've only got 1 type of conflict in every scene, it doesn't feel like your characters are 3-dimensional. And here's the thing, conflict reveals character. Now, I learn about who a character is. If I'm watching a movie, I learn about who a character is, what their values are, what their beliefs are, all by how they deal with conflict. A lot of writers, they ask, well, how can I reveal something about my character? My answer is always this: conflict. Put them in a situation and let us see how they navigate the situation, and we'll know a lot more about that character. So let's talk about the 3 buckets here. So we've got our first bucket, internal conflict. This is conflict that takes place within a character. This is you not wanting to turn your alarm clock off when it goes off in the morning. You know you should get up, but you don't want to. I mean, this is you when someone offers you dessert and you want it, but you know you should defer and choose a healthier option. This is internal conflict. But internal conflict does break down into a few subcategories. The first one is physical needs. Things like I just mentioned, getting up, eating healthy, things like that. And that's what we tend to think of when we start thinking of internal conflict. It's just the physical, like I want to do this, but I probably should do this. That's fine, but there are other types. And one of those other subcategories or types are emotions. I mean, how your character feels about the situation or others in the scene. Maybe they're happy to be in that particular place, in that particular location, until they see someone else is present. Well, now they've got an emotional conflict. Maybe they're looking forward to this event or something like that, only to learn of some bad news right before they show up. So now they're dreading, and they're the guest of honor, so they got to kind of put on a face, but they don't feel like it. That's emotional internal conflict. Another subcategory of internal conflict is authority. And this has to do with power. I mean, is the character in charge, or do they have some type of power in this moment? Maybe they want more power than they actually have. Maybe they don't want the power. Maybe they're trying to gain power or defer. So when a character is struggling with the authority, either that they have or that they want, okay, that's also part of internal conflict. And another subcategory is the morality subcategory. You know, a character in this place knows what is right and they know what's wrong, okay? But they want to do one in one instance. Maybe they should do the other, or should they do this one or that one? Or they have a conflict of their own moral code that is being presented to them. Like, hey, here's this other thing. You're like, I don't know if I really think that's right. And yet everybody else is kind of doing it. Should I do it? Should I not? That's a moral kind of subcategory, moral internal conflict. The last subcategory I will mention is the philosophical one. Now, this is when a character's beliefs are challenged. Maybe they strongly believe in something like nonviolence, but someone breaks into their home. So are they going to resort to physical force or not? And if so, what's going to be the fallout from that decision? That's an internal conflict moment. If we know that the character has a problem with violence and yet we see them contemplating whether to be violent to protect somebody that they care about, that's going to be an internal conflict moment. Now, what all of this means is that you can have multiple subcategories at play at the same time. So let's say a character is on a deserted island and they're hungry. Okay, they're hungry. But they also believe that they shouldn't kill anything, but there's a rabbit. We have some physical internal conflict at play because the character's hungry and they want to satisfy that urge, but they also have a philosophical internal conflict going on because to get some food, they're going to have to go against some of their core beliefs. And you can start stacking all these subcategories on top of one another if you really wanted to, in theory. But in practice, you don't really want to do that, because what happens is it starts to get confusing for the audience. So really, you're only wanting one or two from this bucket, or really any given bucket, at a time. Now, there's others that may crop up. So in this scene, we've got a philosophical internal conflict, and in the next scene, we've got a moral internal conflict. In the next scene, we've got an authority internal conflict. So I can kind of go back and forth between them. They're all still internal conflict, but they all feel different because they're different subcategories of that same bucket. Moving on, interpersonal conflict. This is conflict that takes place between characters. So might be one other character, but it could also be a group of characters. So you can have one character against a group. That's still technically an interpersonal conflict. Or you might have one character and there's a group of people, but this character has this issue with this one, this issue with this one, this issue with this one. So there's multiple interpersonal conflicts going on. Now, the simplest type of interpersonal conflict is you've got two characters in the same scene and they want the same thing, but only one of them can have it. So there's a promotion available and two characters want it, but only one of them's gonna get it. There's gonna be some interpersonal conflict. And like internal conflict, interpersonal conflict breaks down into a few subcategories that are pretty similar to the internal ones. Actually, they're kind of identical. You kind of have the same subcategories within those buckets. So you have a physical subcategory. So obviously when characters are going after something tangible, hopefully that makes sense. You've got emotional subcategories. So when characters are trying to persuade or force another character to feel a certain way, either about the environment or the situation or someone else or even about themselves. I'm trying to modify your emotions. I'm trying to manipulate your emotions of the character in the scene. That's an emotional interpersonal conflict because the other character, they don't want to feel that way. You also have the authority subcategory. Now, this is probably the second most common one because a lot of interpersonal conflict comes down to who has the power in the scene or who thinks they have the power. The real issues always start to crop up when the criteria for who has the power are viewed differently. So, for example, if one character thinks that the smartest person should be the one in charge, when another character thinks that the one with the most money should be in charge. Now, smart people, they've got some power. People with money, they have power. But what happens when you put two people that have those beliefs together? There's going to be some interpersonal conflict about who should really be in charge. There's also a subcategory of morality. So let's say someone who has power is asking someone else, so an employee, for example, to do something that that employee believes to be wrong. How's that character going to respond? I mean, if they do the thing, they're doing what they should do because the boss has asked them to do it. The boss has the power. But if they refuse on moral grounds, well, that might have some other repercussions. And we have the philosophical subcategory. And this is where we get into the beliefs that go against what other people believe. And it's not really that people may disagree with someone else's philosophy. It's that they disagree with how someone else is doing something. Let's say we've got two people. We've got Frank and Barry. And Frank and Barry are in a building and the building is on fire. Now, both Frank and Barry believe that they should save as many people as possible. They're in agreement on that one. Okay, we should save as many people as possible. But Frank thinks the best way to do that is to start fighting the fire. We're going to get fire extinguishers and try to put the fire out. Barry, however, thinks the best way to help people is to get them out of the building. Now, neither solution is necessarily wrong, okay? But Frank and Barry are going to have a philosophical disagreement about what to do because they disagree on how to live out their own personal philosophy of saving people. So when you start talking about philosophical disagreements and philosophical interpersonal conflicts, it doesn't have to mean that the characters have differing philosophies. They might have the same philosophy, but different ways that they believe they should carry out and live out that philosophy. That also creates a philosophical interpersonal conflict. And like internal conflict, you can stack interpersonal conflict subcategories. So using Frank and Barry's philosophical disagreement here, what if Frank is Barry's boss? Okay, well, that adds another layer of conflict because now I've got some authority issues going on top of the philosophical ones. That is another layer of conflict. So you can stack them. Now, I do want to talk a little bit more about moral and philosophical conflict, but I'm going to circle back to that here in a moment so we can go ahead and deal with external conflict first and just what that is. We'll talk about that, and we're going to circle back around. External conflict is probably the most easy to understand because it is conflict that is an outside force that impacts the characters. And this outside force can't really be changed or reasoned with. It's just relentless. It's going to keep coming. And there's really two primary subcategories of external conflict. The first one is weather or climate. So when you start thinking of things like wind, tornadoes, hurricanes, volcanoes, thunderstorms, cold fronts, heat waves, anything weather related is an element of external conflict. This is why you so often see rain in movies. It's just another layer of conflict that makes things worse. I mean, yes, it impacts the mood and the tone, but rain always makes things just a little more difficult unless you're like singing and dancing in the rain. Rain, it kind of makes things worse. Things get muddy, things get more difficult, they get messy. Now I'm wet, now I don't look right. It's rain always makes a problem. The other subcategory of external conflict that you don't normally think of is the element of time. So any kind of deadline or ticking clock or looming end date is an external piece of conflict. You can't speed up the clock. You can't make it slow down. It's just going to keep coming. It's relentless. Ticking clocks, deadlines, they are great pieces of external conflict. And most stories have both a weather element at some point and a ticking clock at some point, right? We got to catch the killer before he kills again. We got to find the nuke before it blows up. We got to finish the presentation before the meeting on Friday at 9 a.m. We want to graduate on time. We want to get home on time. And you can roll ticking clocks. So like once one expires, you can set a new one. So I've got this one, but now there's another one. And then there's another one, right? Or I've got one big one because I can add a ticking clock. So I've got one big one and then I can add one on top of it. If you start doing this though, if you start adding ticking clocks while one's already going and you're adding another, think of that as like layers on a cake. And you've got to have the bottom one, right? Before you add a top one. But once you add a top one, I can't remove the bottom one. So I've got to resolve the new one first, and then I can resolve the one that's on the bottom. If you don't do that, if you start one and then you start another and then you stop the bottom one first before you stop the second one, it starts to feel like your story is being told out of order and it's a little confusing. So just a little side note, if you've got a long ticking clock and you add another one on top, that one needs to be resolved before the other one gets resolved. So don't forget about time as an external conflict element. It's great to use and it's often overlooked. And there's a lot of creative ways to incorporate a ticking clock of some kind, you know, like clean your room before mom gets home. And I haven't forgotten, I promise we're going to get to tips on how to add more conflict in a moment. We're getting so close, but I just want to circle back very briefly to moral and philosophical conflict because you're going to run into some different theories on these elements. Sometimes they're added as a completely new bucket of conflict. So you've got internal, interpersonal, external, and then moral and philosophical. Well, I'm going to take some issue with that because moral and philosophical conflict, they must take into account a character. And a character's conflict is either internal with themselves or interpersonal with someone else. As such, they're tied to conflict in those buckets. So I don't really agree that they're separate buckets of conflict. Now, you can tap into them, of course, because they're subcategories of those larger buckets, but they're not in and of themselves distinct. They're part of those other buckets. So use them, of course, but don't think of them as their own thing. There is, however, one other type of conflict that isn't one of these three buckets. So let me explain. These buckets explain conflict between the characters and the environments of a story, and they exist solely within the story. So as we talk about adding conflict into a story, these are the only three buckets. Because we're dealing with a story, these are the three buckets we have to play with. However, there is another person or group of people participating in the story, and that is the audience. The audience is watching the story unfold, and by watching, they are participating in the story, and you, the storyteller, can further engage the audience, and you should engage the audience, in what we would commonly refer to as theme. Now, the theme often explores a fundamental conflict that you, the storyteller, and by extension the audience, experiences in our world. Things like, should we speak up when we see an injustice, but have no power to change it? Should people who don't look like me or have the same resources I have be treated like lesser people? If we can't get justice, should we take matters into our own hands? I mean, these are questions of philosophical conflict for the audience that the audience can experience when watching or participating in your story. In other words, you have conflict going on within the story, okay? But you can also have conflict being expressed and experienced by the audience and for them to wrestle with while they watch the story. So if we take the justice into our own hands question, maybe one character in the story is intent on becoming a vigilante when he sees the legal system break down. But there's another character who disagrees with the vigilante and with vigilante acts. And so in the story, there is conflict, okay? So these characters are having some interpersonal conflict. But the audience is also being asked to wrestle with the philosophical question. So there is a place for philosophical conflict and kind of really for also moral conflict as it relates to the audience. And these are kind of their own bucket in that sense. But if we're talking about story only, okay, so we're talking about just the story, what's on the screen, then the moral and philosophical conflict are subcategories of the other three buckets. In the story, you really only have those three buckets to work with. Hopefully that is making sense to you. Now, before I get into all the other tips that I'm going to give you, I'm going to give you 5 tips. Please interact in some way. If you're finding value, like, subscribe, all that fun stuff. Share on social media if you want to do that. Comment below, ask questions, all of that fun stuff. I really do appreciate it. It helps other people find this channel, and I'm so very grateful for you doing that. So thank you for doing that. Additionally, if you want to go a lot deeper into conflict and scene development than what I'm doing here, because honestly, I'm just kind of scratching the surface. It might feel like I'm not, but I kind of am. You should consider joining the Screenwriting Fast Track and join other students in the screenwriting course I wish I would have had when I was starting out. There is a whole lot of information there that I just cannot pack into a YouTube video, and it will level up your writing abilities. So if you want more of that, if you want to just go deeper into conflict and understanding it and characters and building characters and scenes and all that, Screenwriting Fast Track, you should take a look at. Maybe though you don't want help just with the conflict part, you want to help with the whole thing because you want to transform yourself into a writer who tells stories that matter and tells them masterfully. If you want to do that, then you might want to consider joining my Screenplay Navigator. There's a link below. I help you become a writer that you want to be. There's lots of group interaction. You work at your own pace. It's a lot of great fun. So be sure to check that out. Screenplay Navigator. Links are below. Schedule a free call. Apply for the program if that's of interest to you. If you want to transform your writer self, Screenplay Navigator might be for you. All right, you've waited long enough. Let's get to some of the tips. So 5 tips. First tip, in each of your scenes, identify the types of conflict you have at play. Try to learn to identify what the conflict is, okay? So you're gonna quickly start to see the types of conflict you're using and how often you're using them and really what's lacking. You may even want to make some notes as you go through about each scene. Because one of the things that's going to happen is you're going to start to see, hey, I'm using this same kind of conflict over and over and over again, and I'm not using any of these others. That's something that can really help you out. You've got to learn to identify what you're using. So take some time, look at your scenes, pull them apart. What are you using? Are you using the same kind of conflict over and over? I mean, if you've got external time and internal physical over and over and over again, okay, that's probably going to be a problem. You want to start shaking things up. It's going to start feeling like, as you're reading your story, if you don't change anything, like I'm just kind of doing the same thing over and over, one trick pony. So you start adding in the other types, but you don't know what other types to add in until you know what you've got. So first thing, you've got to identify the types of conflict that you've got. It's also going to help you add more conflict, and you're going to be able to identify those patterns in that particular story. So tip number one, identify the types of conflict you've got. There's a lot of them. I gave you at least 12, give or take. There's like 3 buckets with 5 subcategories in the first 2 and 2 in the last one. So that's 12. So you got at least 12 types of conflict you can use. So what types of conflict are you using, identify them, and see what other ones you are not using and maybe what ones you can add in. Second tip, make sure you know the core moral and philosophical beliefs of your main and supporting characters. Now, ideally, you figure this out as you're creating your story because you want to create characters that will naturally fight. So you drop some of them in a scene, they're going to have an argument. And this is very true if you're writing scripts for TV. I mean, if you've got a group of coworkers, for example, I've got 5 coworkers, I want them to be different enough that I can drop any 2 of them into a room and they're going to fight about something. They're going to argue about something. Understanding your philosophical and moral conflicts of each of those characters will help you make sure that they're different enough that they're always going to have some kind of conflict. Ideally, this is also true for a movie script. So make sure your characters have differing moral and philosophical beliefs. Now, a caveat here, you don't have to go on a deep dive on this. Just the basic things. Like, what are the 1 or 2 things for each character that they really care about? What's their main moral belief, their main philosophical belief as it relates to the story? All the other stuff, I don't have to worry about that. I don't have to care whether or not this character, thinks that we should pay taxes or not. That's so far down the list. I don't need to go that far. Tip 3, make sure the goals of each of your main and supporting characters are very clear. It is hard to create conflict if you don't know what a character is after, if you don't know where they're headed, if you don't know what they want. It's like, oh, I'm just going to have them fight. Okay, but what are they fighting about? What is one character trying to do that the other one is preventing them from doing? Remember, it's somebody who wants something, and conflict is an obstacle for any character getting what they want. So you got to know what they want. And I see this all the time with my students and clients. They've got characters and they're fighting, but it's like, what are they fighting about? And I don't know, I just thought they should fight. It's like, no, there's got to be a clear goal. And if I know that clear goal, I know where to put stuff to slow them down or block their path because I know where they're going. So I know what's going to block them. I know what's going to slow them down. Now, many times the goal is too vague. So you got to make sure your goals are specific and tangible for each of your characters. Make sure you know what they're all after. Number 4, move the first confrontation between the protagonist and the antagonist earlier in the story. Like a lot earlier. If it happens on page 60, have the first interaction half it. So on page 30. Maybe not always, but really move it up. I mean, yes, your main character is going to have it out with the antagonist at some point. They're going to have it out. But why not have some kind of conflict sooner? Move it sooner. What that does is, because your antagonist is more than likely really going to decisively win that confrontation, that's going to make it feel like it's even further to go for our main character. It's going to make them suffer even more, which is what we want. But I can hear the retort right now. You're like, okay, but Jake, if I do that, then I don't know where to go with my story. I don't know what's happened next. Well, that's great, Because one, that's the job of a writer, for you to figure it out. And two, if you don't know where you're supposed to go, neither will your audience. I mean, now your story is unpredictable. So have this confrontation with the antagonist much earlier in the story than when you were planning. It's a great way to heighten the conflict, heighten the tension, and it spins things in new ways and makes things unpredictable and makes things harder, makes your characters suffer. It's all good on all accounts. So move it sooner. If it happens really late, move it much sooner. Last tip I'll give you for creating more conflict. Do one of the following two things. Kill off a supporting character that's helping your protagonist, or have a supporting character betray your protagonist. Both of these are major setbacks for your main character. I mean, the person they were counting on to help them is either no longer there or now is fighting against them. And you don't even have to kill them off. I mean, maybe they just get arrested or hurt or taken out of the picture in some way. Most of the time, giving a major setback to your protagonist is a great way to facilitate more conflict, because you immediately make it more difficult for your character to get what they are after. So you want to make it difficult, more conflict, more conflict, more conflict. Hopefully this has been helpful to you, and if it has, please be sure to like, subscribe, bell, all those things. I really do appreciate it. Let me know in the comments what's been helpful to you here. If you've got other questions, please feel free to drop that in a comment below. And when you go to tell a story, make sure you have enough conflict, more conflict, and tell a story that matters. See you later.